The helicopter dropped fast and I remember thinking, not screaming, not praying, just thinking, this is a weird way to die. I'd been in the air maybe 40 minutes. We were supposed to be landing at a remote campsite north of Timmins, Ontario. One of those fly-in fishing lodges that Northgate Capital used for their annual client retreat. I was 29 years old, a junior analyst who'd been with the firm for 14 months, and I had exactly zero business being on that helicopter. My director, Sylvia Crane, had asked me to sub in last minute because her original guest, a senior partner from Calgary, had come down with something. You'll carry my bag, take notes, look presentable, she'd said. That's it. Sylvia was 44. She'd built Northgate's mid-market advisory division from a team of 3 into something that managed close to $2 billion in assets. She wore the same style of dark blazer every day, and drank her coffee black, and never laughed at anything that wasn't actually funny. In 14 months, I don't think she'd said more than 40 words to me that weren't work-related. I didn't mind. You didn't get close to Sylvia Crane. You delivered, you stayed out of the way, and if she remembered your name after a year, you were doing fine. The pilot's name was Ted. He'd been flying bush planes and helicopters in northern Ontario for 22 years. He told us that on the way up, unprompted, in the cheerful way of a man who loves his job and assumes everyone else is as comfortable with small aircraft as he is. I was not comfortable with small aircraft. I had my laptop bag on my knees and I was staring at the tree line when the engine made a sound it wasn't supposed to make. Like a cough, a hard, wet cough that felt wrong even to someone who knew nothing about helicopters. Ted said, "Hang on." That was all he said. The nose dipped, and then we were spinning slowly, and then the tree line was coming up very fast, and I grabbed the seat with both hands and I thought, this is a weird way to die. And then there was a sound like the world tearing open. I woke up and my face was pressed against cold pine needles. My first thought was that my left shoulder hurt badly enough that I made a sound I'd never made before in my life. This low, involuntary grunt that came from somewhere deep. I pushed myself up on my right arm and looked around. The helicopter had come down in a narrow clearing between stands of black spruce. The tail section was about 20 meters from the cockpit, which had crumpled forward into a boulder and split open on the left side. There was smoke but no fire, which I would only later understand was extremely lucky. "Ted," I called out. Nothing. I got to my feet and my vision went white for a second. I stood still until it cleared, and then I walked toward the cockpit, and I won't describe what I found there in detail. Ted had been 43 years old. He had a daughter in Sudbury who played hockey. He'd told us that too on the way up. I stood there for a moment and then I turned away. "Hey." The voice came from my left. Sylvia was sitting with her back against a spruce tree maybe 15 feet from the wreck. She'd been thrown clear somehow. She had a cut across her forehead that had bled down into her eyebrow and dried there, and she was holding her right wrist against her stomach. "You're walking," she said. "Yeah, Ted?" I looked at her. She closed her eyes for a second and then opened them again. "Okay," she said. "Okay." She said it the way you say something when you're your forced self to move on. "How bad do I look?" I almost said fine the way you reflexively say fine when someone asks that. But I stopped myself. She wasn't asking for comfort, she was assessing. "Forehead cut's not deep," I said. "Your wrist, can you rotate it?" She tried and winced. "Probably sprained. What about you, left shoulder?" "I can move everything." "Good." She stood up slowly, didn't ask for help, and walked to the wreck and looked at what I'd looked at. She stood there longer than I had, then she walked back. "The ELT should have activated on impact," she said. "Should have? It's mounted in the tail section." She looked toward where the tail had ended up. "I don't know if it survived." I went and checked. The emergency locator transmitter was a small orange device bolted into the frame. It was intact, and there was a light blinking on it. "It's on," I called back. "Okay," she said. "Okay, so someone's already looking for us." That should have been the end of the story. ELT activated, coordinates transmitted, search and rescue on the way. We sit tight, we get found, we go home, except the weather rolled in that night. I'm not a meteorologist and I don't know exactly what happened. But what I know is that by 6 o'clock the temperature had dropped 15 degrees, and a front was moving in from the northwest. By 8 o'clock it was raining sideways, the kind of cold October rain that northern Ontario does like it's trying to make a point. The helicopter wreck gave us partial shelter. I found a survival kit in the cargo hold. Ted was a professional, he'd carried one. With a mylar blanket, a lighter, some emergency rations, a first aid kit, and a hand crank radio that received but couldn't transmit. We got a fire going inside the partial shelter of the fuselage. Barely. It took me 4 tries and both of us feeding it tiny sticks before it caught. Sylvia sat across from the small fire, and I sat on the other side and we were quiet for a while. "Do you know how to build a shelter?" she asked. "No, do you know anything about wilderness survival?" "I went to one camping trip in Scouts when I was 11 and it rained the whole time." She almost smiled. "Almost? Okay, neither do I, not really. But we have fire, we have the structure, we have the ELT. We just need to stay warm and wait. How long? Flight plans said we were due at the lodge by 4. It's after 8, they'll have called it in. She paused. But in this weather they won't fly until it clears. The forecast on the hand crank radio when we finally got a signal said the front would take 3 to 4 days to pass. 3 to 4 days. I sat with that for a minute. Right, I said. Right, she said. The first day was mostly practical. We inventoried everything, figured out the food situation, not great but manageable, and worked out a sleeping rotation so someone was always keeping the fire going. Sylvia's wrist was sprained, not broken, she'd decided, which meant she could do most things with her left hand. My shoulder was bruised deep, but the joint was intact. We didn't talk much. It wasn't uncomfortable exactly. It was more like we were both very focused on not dying, which has a way of cutting through social awkwardness. On the second day it rained so hard the fire nearly went out twice, and we spent most of the afternoon huddled in the fuselage under the mylar blanket, arms pressed together for heat, not speaking, listening to the rain hammer the wreckage. That was when things started to change. Not in the way you might expect. Not dramatically. It was smaller than that. It started because I was cold and shaking and she said without fanfare, "Come here," and shifted so I could get more of the mylar over me. And then we were sitting shoulder to shoulder in a crumpled helicopter in the middle of nowhere, and she said quietly, like she was talking to herself as much as me, "I haven't been outside of Toronto for anything that wasn't work in 3 years." I didn't say anything. I didn't know what to say. "My sister keeps asking me to come visit her in Halifax," she said. "I keep saying I'll come when things slow down." "Do things slow down?" She was quiet for a moment. No, we didn't say anything for a while after that, but something had shifted. The way it shifts when someone shows you the underside of something they usually keep covered. I told her about my dad. I don't know why I started, except that it felt like the kind of silence where it was okay to. He'd had a heart attack the previous February, not a bad one, but bad enough. He lived in Guelph 45 minutes away, and I'd visited him 4 times since. 4 times in 8 months. I told myself it was because of work, because of the hours, because of the 100 small fires you put out every week in a job like mine. "It's easier to not go," I said, "because every time I go I feel like I should go more." She didn't tell me I should call him more. She didn't offer advice at all, she just said, "Yeah, that makes sense." That was the moment I understood something about Sylvia Crane that the office never would have shown me. She wasn't cold. She was just compressed. She'd taken everything soft in herself and pressed it down very small to make room for everything the job required. And out here, with no job to perform for, it was decompressing. Slowly, the way something does when it's been under pressure for a long time. On the 3rd morning, the rain broke for a few hours, and we went outside and tried to signal with the mylar blanket in case any aircraft was looking. We didn't see or hear anything, but the air was clear and cold and felt like breathing for the first time in days. We ate the last of the real food, 2 granola bars and a packet of trail mix, and sat on a log outside the wreck and watched a pair of ravens work their way through the tree line looking for something. "What made you go into finance?" she asked. I thought about it. "My dad worked at a credit union for 30 years, I said. "I watched him be careful with money his whole life. Never once bought anything new if used would do. I think I wanted to understand money well enough that I didn't have to be afraid of it." She looked at me for a moment. "That's the most honest answer to that question I've ever heard. What about you?" She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I thought she wasn't going to answer. Then she said, "I had a business my ex-husband and I started together. Home renovation. It did well. Then we split up and I had to buy him out. And to buy him out I had to sell the business because I didn't have the capital. And I walked away with about $40,000 and nothing else. I went back to school at 31. Took the CFA. Told myself I would never be in a position where someone else had control of my financial future. I didn't say anything. "I'm not good at this," she said, meaning the talking, meaning any of this. "I want you to know I'm aware of that." "You're doing okay," I said. She looked at the ravens. "The bar in a helicopter crash is low." I laughed. Genuinely laughed, the first time in 3 days. And she did too, a short, surprised sound like she'd caught herself. We were found on the 4th day. A search and rescue helicopter came in low around 10 in the morning. We'd heard it before we saw it, and we ran out into the clearing and waved the mylar blanket like idiots. Both of us yelling even though they could clearly already see us. The paramedics came down on a line. There were 2 of them, calm and thorough, and they checked us over and got us into the helicopter. And that was it. It was over. I remember the flight back felt completely unreal. Like being returned to a world that had continued without you, unchanged. While you'd been somewhere very different. They took us to Health Sciences North in Sudbury for evaluation. Sylvia's wrist was confirmed as a moderate sprain. My shoulder had a partial tear in the rotator cuff that would need physio. We were treated and given clean clothes from a donation bin. She ended up in a Sudbury Wolves hoodie and jeans 2 sizes too big, and we sat in a waiting area while someone from the firm arranged transport back to Toronto. A woman named Patrice from Northgate's executive operations team arrived within 2 hours. She had a company car and a folder of paperwork and a very specific, very practiced calm about her. She handed each of us a phone. "Your families have been contacted," she said. "The CEO would like to speak with you both when you're ready." Then she pulled 2 envelopes from the folder. She handed one to Sylvia, who opened it and read it, and then set it down on the seat beside her and didn't say anything. She handed the other to me. The letter was brief. It was from Northgate's general counsel. It explained that given the incident, they called it the incident, the firm was prepared to offer me a payment of $75,000, structured as an addition to my year-end compensation, in exchange for my agreement not to speak publicly about the details of the 4 days in the field, including the nature of any personal conversations, the condition of parties involved, or any observations about company operations or personnel. There was a signature line at the bottom. I read it twice. Then I looked up at Patrice, who was looking at a fixed point on the wall across the room. "What happened to Ted's family?" I asked. Patrice blinked. "I believe someone from HR has been in contact. Does his daughter know?" "I'm not able to speak to that." $75,000. I was making $68,000 a year. This was more than a year's salary, handed to me in a hospital waiting room, in exchange for not talking about. What exactly? That Sylvia Crane had a sister in Halifax she never visited? That she'd once owned a renovation company? That we'd spent 4 days keeping each other alive and somewhere in that had become something like human beings to each other? I looked over at Sylvia. She was looking at her envelope, not at me. "Sylvia," I said. She looked up. "What's in yours?" She held it out. Her letter was similar to mine, but the amount was different, and hers included a clause about not pursuing any legal claims related to the company's choice of aviation contractor, the maintenance records of the helicopter, or the flight planning decisions made by executive operations in the 2 weeks prior to the retreat. I read that line twice. Maintenance records. Flight planning decisions in the 2 weeks prior. "Patrice," I said, "was there a mechanical issue with the helicopter that the company knew about before we got on it?" Patrice's expression didn't change. "I'm not in a position to speak to the details of the investigation." "That's not an answer. I understand." I put the letter down on the seat beside me. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because I've thought about it a lot since. Part of me, a real part, not a small part, wanted to sign it. $75,000 is not a number you look at and feel nothing. I was 29. I had student loans and a creaky 1-bedroom in the annex and a rotator cuff that was going to cost me months of physio. Part of me wanted to take the pen and sign the line and get on the company car back to Toronto and never speak of it again. But there was another part. The part that had spent 4 days in a wrecked helicopter in the rain and come out the other side. The part that had sat on a log in Northern Ontario and watched ravens and talked about my dad. I folded the letter and put it in the pocket of the donated jeans. "I need to speak to my own lawyer before I sign anything," I said. Patrice nodded once. Of course. Sylvia was watching me. I don't know exactly what was in her face right then. Something careful, something that was deciding something. She folded her letter too. Put it in the front pocket of the Sudbury Wolves hoodie. "Same," she said. "I took 3 weeks off for my shoulder. I called my dad the night I got back to Toronto, and he drove down from Guelph the next morning, and we sat in my kitchen for 4 hours, and he made scrambled eggs, and we talked about things we hadn't talked about in years. I don't want to say the crash was good for anything, because it wasn't. Ted is dead and his daughter is without her father, and nothing I got from those 4 days balances that. But I sat in my kitchen with my dad and we talked, and that was real, and I don't know that it would have happened otherwise. I didn't sign the letter. Not then, and not after I spoke to a lawyer, who told me that the clause about maintenance records was significant and that I should be very careful. What came out, over the following months, through the Transportation Safety Board investigation, was that the helicopter had had a reported fault in the engine fuel system, logged by a third-party maintenance crew 6 weeks before the retreat, and that Northgate's executive operations team had approved the charter anyway. Not because they were careless, because the retreat had been rescheduled twice already, and the CEO was losing patience, and someone made a call they shouldn't have made. Ted's daughter filed a wrongful death suit. It settled out of court. I gave a statement to the TSB investigators, and I told them everything I knew, which was mostly just what I'd observed, not what I understood. Northgate didn't fire me. I think they thought that would have looked bad. Or maybe they'd decided I wasn't actually a threat. I stayed another 8 months and then I left for a smaller firm, where I knew the partners and could see the whole operation. Before I left, Sylvia called me into her office. She closed the door, which she almost never did, and she sat down and she looked at me with that particular expression she had, where you could tell she was choosing her words with real care. "I want to say something," she said, "and I want you to understand I'm not good at this. You mentioned that." The corner of her mouth moved. "I was glad you were the one in that helicopter with me," she said. "Not not for any reason except that you were steady. In a situation where most people wouldn't have been steady, and I don't think I said that." "You didn't," I said. "She didn't ask me to stay, she wouldn't have, that wasn't who she was. But she did stand up and put out her hand, and I shook it, and she held it a second longer than was strictly necessary." "Call your dad," she said. "Yeah," I said. "I will." I called him that evening. He was watching the Leafs lose, which is a Canadian constant reliable as gravity. He sounded happy to hear from me. I told him I was thinking about driving up for Thanksgiving. He said, "About time." And I thought about a clearing in the spruce trees north of Timmins, and 2 ravens working through the tree line, and a woman in a borrowed hoodie sitting on a log saying something honest about her life. And I thought, yeah, it was about time.